Imagine for a moment that you were standing in the middle of the scorching red dust desert of southeastern Utah in the 1940s, wiping sweat from your forehead as you watch a man do something that looks absolutely insane. Because right there in the shadow of a massive ancient sandstone cliff, a man named Albert Christensen is drilling a hole into the solid rock face with nothing but grit and a stick of dynamite. It wasn't just a hobby or a way to pass the time, but an obsession that made the locals in the nearby town of Moab shake their heads and whisper that the harsh desert sun had finally cooked poor Albert's brain. Because while everyone else was building sensible wooden cabins or brick houses on the flat ground where it was easy to lay a foundation, Albert was looking at a giant, unforgiving boulder and seeing a palace hidden inside the stone. You have to understand that back then, this part of the country was rugged and unforgiving, a place where conformity was usually the safest bet for survival. So when Albert announced that he wasn't going to build a house on the land, but rather carve a house into the land, the laughter was almost immediate and brutal. They called him the Mole of Moab, or simply the Crazy Hermit, chuckling as they drove by his claim on the highway, pointing out the window at the cloud of dust rising from the cliffside where Albert was working alone. Day after day, month after month, chipping away at millions of years of geology with tools that seemed far too small for the job. But Albert didn't even care about the laughter or the finger pointing, because he knew something that his neighbors didn't. Something about the brutal nature of the desert that they would only learn the hard way when the seasons turned. So he just kept on working, lighting fuses and running for cover, listening to the muffled thump of explosions deep inside the rock. Then, spending hours hauling out the rubble by hand in a wheelbarrow that squeaked and groaned under the weight of his impossible dream. It wasn't just a cave he was making, and that's what people didn't understand at first, thinking he was just going to live like a bear in a dark hole. But Albert had a vision of a proper home with bedrooms and a kitchen and a living room, all seamlessly integrated into the natural stone. A place where the walls were painted by nature and the ceiling was the very bones of the earth itself. The work was incredibly slow and dangerous, requiring a level of patience that most modern people can't even comprehend, as he had to drill precise holes into the sandstone, insert the dynamite, blast it, wait for the dust to settle, and then physically remove tons of debris just to gain a few feet of space, inching his way backward into the cliff face like a man digging his own tomb, or so the neighbors thought. As the years dragged on, the laughter didn't stop. But it did change tone slightly, moving from amusement to pity, because the locals saw a man wasting the prime years of his life covered in gray dust, his hands calloused and bleeding, seemingly fighting a war against nature that he couldn't possibly win, especially since he was doing almost all of it entirely by himself. He wasn't a rich man hiring a crew of miners to do the heavy lifting. He was just a regular guy with a singular, driving purpose that kept him waking up before dawn and working until the sun dipped below the red horizon, leaving him in the cooling shadows of the rock that had become his entire world. People would stop by occasionally, maybe to offer him a drink of water or just to see if he had finally given up. And they would ask him why on earth he was putting himself through this torture when he could just buy a stack of lumber and have a roof over his head in a few weeks. But Albert would just smile that cryptic smile of a man who sees the future and tell them that what rots in bricks crumble. But the rock has been here for 1,000,000 years, and it will be here for 1,000,000 more. He was building something permanent in a world that felt temporary. And even though his progress was painfully slow, he began to hollow out what would eventually become a 5,000 square foot mansion, complete with 14 rooms arranged around huge pillars of natural stone that he left in place to hold up the ceiling, creating a space that was both primitive and strangely modern. The most shocking part of the early years wasn't just the physical labor, but the sheer loneliness of the endeavor. Because when you are doing something that everyone else thinks is foolish, you end up isolated, pushed to the fringes of the community, viewed as an eccentric oddity rather than a neighbor. And there were surely nights when Albert lay on a cot outside the entrance to his cave, looking up at the vast expanse of stars, wondering if maybe the critics were right and he had lost his mind. But then the sun would rise, heating the desert floor until the air shimmered with heat waves, and he would step into the cool, dark shade of his excavation and feel the temperature drop 20 or 30 degrees instantly. A natural air conditioning that required no electricity and never broke down. And that feeling of relief gave him the strength to pick up the drill and start all over again. He was driven by a memory of his childhood, perhaps, or a desire to leave a mark that would be washed away by the flash floods or blown down by the canyon winds. A monument to human persistence that proved that if you are stubborn enough, you can literally move mountains, or at least move into them. The hook here is that for 12 long years, this went on, a dozen years of blasting and hauling and sweating while the town of Moab grew and changed. And still, Albert was there at the rock, a fixture of the landscape like a stubborn juniper tree, Until finally, the seasons began to shift in a way that nobody expected, bringing a winter so fierce that it would wipe the smiles off the faces of everyone who had ever cracked a joke about the man living in the hole. After more than a decade of relentless labor, Albert had managed to carve out a massive interior space, pushing deep into the sandstone cliff, creating a living room that was 65 feet long and a kitchen that looked like something out of a Flintstones fantasy but functioned with all the practicality of a modern home. Yet the real test of his creation wasn't about aesthetics or architecture, but about survival. The neighbors, safe in their wooden frame houses down in the valley, had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the seasons in the high desert, which usually meant scorching summers and cold but manageable winters, leading them to build homes that were essentially light shells. Efficient enough for the average year, but woefully unprepared for a true anomaly. Then came the winter that changed everything. A season when the sky turned a bruised purple and the temperature plummeted not just to freezing, but far below zero, accompanied by a wind that screamed down the canyons like a freight train, carrying with it a blinding white curtain of snow that buried the roads and froze the water pipes solid. This wasn't just a snowstorm. It was a blizzard of historic proportions for the region, the kind of weather event that catches people completely off guard because they've spent so long believing that the climate is their friend. And suddenly, the thin walls of those sensible wooden cabins that the neighbors were so proud of began to feel like paper against the gale force winds. Inside those traditional homes, families were huddled around wood stoves that couldn't keep up with the heat loss, stuffing rags into the cracks around the windows where the draft hissed like a snake, watching the frost creep up the inside of the glass, and feeling the biting cold settle into their bones no matter how many blankets they piled on. The wind was so fierce that it shook the foundations of the lighter structures, rattling the dishes in the cupboards and keeping children awake with the fear that the roof might simply lift off and fly away into the dark. Freezing night, leaving them exposed to a cold that could kill a person in minutes. Meanwhile, up at the rock, the scene was entirely different, almost peaceful. Because Albert Christensen was sitting in his living room, reading a book by the light of a lamp, completely insulated from the chaos raging just a few feet away outside his door. You have to realize that sandstone is one of nature's most perfect insulators. A thermal battery that absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly, or maintains a steady subterranean temperature, regardless of what the thermometer says outside. So while the outside world was dropping to dangerous lows, the interior of Albert's cave hovered at a constant, comfortable temperature, protected by millions of tons of solid rock that didn't shake, didn't rattle, and didn't draft. He had drilled a chimney shaft straight up through 65 feet of solid rock to the surface above, a feat of engineering that allowed him to have a roaring fireplace that drew the smoke up and out, creating a cozy, warm atmosphere that felt more like a fortress than a cave. As the storm raged on for days, cutting off power lines and leaving the town struggling to stay warm, Albert was safe in his sanctuary, listening to the muffled howl of the wind, which sounded distant and harmless, like a bad dream happening to someone else, and he must have felt a profound sense of vindication as he sat there in his rocking chair, sipping coffee in his shirt sleeves while he knew his critics were shivering in their coats inside their own living rooms. The thermal mass of the rock meant that he barely even needed to keep the fire roaring to stay warm. The earth itself was hugging him, protecting him, validating every single hour of backbreaking labor he had invested over the last 12 years. It is easy to imagine the contrast to chaos and fear in the valley below versus the serene silence of the rockhouse, where the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the turning of a page. A stark reminder that sometimes the old ways, the primitive ways, are superior to modern conveniences when nature decides to show its teeth. The blizzard was relentless, piling drifts of snow against the doors of the valley homes, trapping people inside, freezing livestock in the fields, and causing pipes to burst all over town, creating a disaster that would take weeks to recover from. But Albert's water supply was secure, his walls were impenetrable, and his roof was an entire mountain that wasn't going anywhere. When the storm finally broke and the sun came out, illuminating a landscape buried in white, the neighbors emerged from their freezing homes, exhausted, bleary-eyed, and shivering, looking up toward the cliff face to see if the crazy hermit had survived the cold, fully expecting to find him frozen solid in his hole. Instead, what they saw was a plume of friendly smoke rising steadily from the rock, signaling that not only was Albert alive, he was probably having a hot breakfast in a house that had dropped below 60 degrees the entire time. That was the moment the laughter stopped for good, replaced by a stunned realization that the man they had mocked for over a decade was the fool. He was the only one who had truly prepared for the worst that the world could throw at him. The aftermath of that blizzard changed the way the community looked at Albert and his hole in the rock. because when they finally made their way up to check on him, they didn't find a shivering survivor, but a gracious host who invited them into a home that felt as solid and welcoming as a cathedral. Stepping from the biting cold of the winter air into the rock house was like stepping into a different world. And for the first time, the neighbors really saw what he had built, not a dark boxed-in pea cave, but a beautiful, artistic dwelling with polished rock floors, niches carved for artwork, and a deep, resonating silence that made the frantic world outside disappear. They saw the bathtub he had carved directly into the stone, the shelves that were part of the wall, and the way the natural light filtered in through the carefully placed windows. And they realized that while they were fighting against the environment, trying to impose square boxers on a round world, Albert had worked with the environment, embracing the stone rather than trying to conquer it. Albert Christensen lived in his rock home for the rest of his life, continuing to refine it, to polish it, to add new touches that made it more unique. And eventually, the very people who had laughed at him began to bring their friends and relatives to see the wonder of the desert, boasting about the local genius who had built a palace inside a cliff. He passed away in 1957, but the story didn't end there because his wife, Gladys, continued his work, and the home became exactly what Albert had always known. It was a masterpiece that would outlast them all. Today, you can actually go to Moab, Utah, and tour Hole in the Rock, walking through the rooms that Albert blasted out by hand, seeing the fireplace and the furniture, and feeling that cool, steady air that saved him during the storms, standing as a testament to the fact that sometimes the craziest ideas are the most brilliant ones. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, about the things we laugh at today? The people we mock because they are doing something different, or difficult, or strange, and whether or not they are actually the ones who are building the future while we are stuck trying to maintain the status quo. Albert's story isn't just about a house or a blizzard. It has a lesson about vision and the courage to pursue a dream even when the whole world tells you that you are wasting your time. Because in the end, when the storms of life command, they always do it as the foundation you built when the sun was shining that determines whether you stand or fall. The neighbors who laughed are all gone now. Their wooden houses likely renovated or torn down or blown away by the sands of time, but Albert's home is still there, solid and immovable. A permanent part of the American landscape that receives thousands of visitors every year who stand in awe of what one man with a drill and a dream can accomplish. So the next time you have an idea that everyone else thinks is crazy, or you want to build something that doesn't fit the mold, remember the man in the Utah desert who dug into the dark to find the light? And remember that the safest place to be during a blizzard is often the place that everyone else was too afraid to build. It's easy to follow the crowd, but it takes a special kind of bravery to grab a shovel and start digging your own path. And who knows, maybe one day the people who are laughing at you will be the ones knocking on your door asking for shelter. If you enjoyed this story of grit, survival, and vindication, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because we have so many more lost history stories to tell you, from the depths of the ocean to the highest peaks of the mountains. Tell me in the comments below, would you have the patience to spend 12 years building your house by hand? Or would you have given up after the first year? I read every single comment, so let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video.